Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about religion and the relationship of the Catholic Church to other religions. And to do this, I want to begin by pointing out that oftentimes on the internet in the Catholic world, we talk about certain contentious issues that rile people up. And, sometimes understandably so. I'm not castigating the whole conversation. But some of these conversations involve the prayer meeting in 1988, I think it was, of several leaders of different religions that happened in the town of Assisi, where Pope St. John Paul II was present. And also, Pope Benedict had his own version of this as well. And more recently, there was the discussion of the Abu Dhabi statement by Pope Francis that took place with the Imam. And all of these events, throughout the last several decades have garnered a lot of discussion, especially on social media. And I wanted to say something about it and bring some wisdom to bear upon the entire discussion, hopefully. Of course, this all begins with, of course, the Second Vatican Council and its document, Nostra Aetate. And so this warrants discussion. It's a very broad topic, and I just wanted to speak about three authors, two of them especially today. One I'll just kind of mention. The first one is William Kavanaugh. The second one is Joseph Ratzinger, of course. And the third one is David Schindler, David C. Schindler. And I just wanted to read some short and hopefully clear excerpts, quotes from their works, and try to lay out a landscape that I don't feel is prevalent in the social media sphere, if that makes sense. So without further ado, I will just jump right into it. And we'll begin with this book. Again, I'm not going to read a book to you. I'm just going to point out certain quotes and discuss them. But I want to begin with this book here. The title is Truth and Tolerance by Joseph Ratzinger. Now, don't be misled or mistaken by the title. This book is basically a defense of Christianity in the face of relativism. So here's the book if you want to see. Truth and Tolerance by Joseph Ratzinger. It is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I know I'm always saying things like this, but I've just given up trying not to sound hyperbolic because I mean it, right? There's a few set of books that are just absolutely incredible, and this is one of them. There's Introduction to Christianity, which I think is less good than this one, but it's phenomenal, of course. There's this one, there's his book Eschatology, and there's other works like David Schindler's Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, things like that. These are just phenomenal books. But this is one of the, De Lubach's Catholicism is another one, of course. But this is one of the best books I've ever read, period. So with that kind of introduction, I want to start with a quote from this book to open the conversation on this contentious-ish topic of religions and the Catholic Church's relationship to them. So on page 50, Joseph Ratzinger writes, the tradition of these two concepts, namely faith and religion, cannot be should be studied anew with this consideration in mind. So that's probably the wrong place to begin. Let me read from the top. Okay, so to me, the concept of Christianity, Ratzinger tells us, without religion, is contradictory and illusory. Faith has to express itself as a religion and through religion, though of course it cannot be reduced to religion. So, we're using the word faith, we're using the word religion. What are we talking about? So he says, the tradition of these two concepts should be studied anew with this consideration in mind. For Thomas Aquinas, for instance, religion is a subdivision of the virtue of righteousness and is, as such, necessary, but it is, of course, quite different from the infused virtue of faith. It seems to me that a postulate of the first order for any carefully differentiated theology of religions would be the precise clarification of the concepts of faith and religion, which are mostly used so as to pass vaguely into each other, and both are equally used in generalized fashion. Thus, people talk of faiths in the plural and intend thereby to designate all religions, Although the idea of faith is by no means present in all religions, is certainly not a constitutive element of all of them, and insofar as it does occur means very different things in them. The broadening of the concept of religion as an overall designation for the relationship of man to the transcendent, on the other hand, has only happened in the second part of the modern period. Right. So here he's saying, this kind of vague definition of religion, which is like man's relationship to the transcendent world, is just so broad. But not only that, it's actually new. So I really want to I want to dive into what religion actually is. He ends here. Such a clarification is urgently needed, especially for Christianity to have a proper understanding of itself and for the way it relates to other world religions. We will come back to this problem later. Yes, he does indeed. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to read. I want to put this aside. We'll come right back to it. But you see, what he's saying here is that religion, for Aquinas, is a sub virtue of justice, of righteousness, he calls it. And faith is an infused theological virtue. So nowadays, however, we talk of faiths, and we mean by that world religions, but faith is not even a category or a term used in some of these religions. So we got to be clear with our language here, right? A lot of times online, people love to argue, which I get it. I'm trying not to, make fun of anybody. Uh, but we don't stop and ask the Socratic questions. What is faith? What is religion? What is history? What is ethics? What is culture, right? We got to stop all of this jumping to conclusions and running around wild with our pants on fire and start asking some fundamental questions like Socrates did. What is piety, Euthyphro? What is justice? Tell me, right? So that's the kind of stuff we need to do. And only if you take your bearings like that can you navigate the world with wisdom. You go to first principles, not with this algorithmic whirlpool of information that titillizes our sense of rage. Anyway, so that being said, I don't have the book with me physically, but I have my Kindle here. I just bought a new Kindle where I have a bunch of books that I use for when I travel now. And this book is by William Cavanaugh, and it's an excellent book. And I'm just going to read the opening of the book, certain little quotes from it that are very telling. The book is called The Myth of Religious Violence, and the subtitle is Secular Ideology as the Roots of Modern Conflict. Okay, so the first quote I want to read goes as follows from William Cavanaugh. He says, "There is nothing close to agreement among scholars on what defines religion. The inability to define religion has been described as, quote, almost an article of methodological dogma, end quote, in the field of religious studies." And then he says, "What separates religion from secular phenomena is therefore described in terms of the content or substance of religious belief." So that's the working definition that seems to be prevalent. Well, religion is that which is not secular. You see how it's not really a definition, right? And it assumes something here. It assumes a worldview, which we'll get into. But he continues, William Cavanaugh continues, substantivist definitions, right? So the definition of religion, which sees it as a substance, as a thing. So substantivist definitions of religion approximate the common Western idea of religion as what Christians and Muslims and Hindus and members of a few other world religions believe and do. Functionalist approaches, on the other hand, expand the definition of religion to include ideologies and practices such as Marxism, nationalism, and free market ideology that are not commonly considered religious. They do so by looking not at content, but at the way that these ideologies and practices function in various contexts to provide an overarching structure of meaning in everyday social life. So what's fascinating here is that you have the substantivists, the functionalists, and depending on who you're talking to, Marxism is a religion. Free market economy ideology is a religion, right? But that's not what the substantivists say. For the substantivists, it is certain doctrines or dogmas or beliefs that have to do with the transcendent, with something to do with the afterlife, an ethical stance towards the afterlife or nirvana or what have you. Again, we see how this is really not clear, basically. right? So let's continue with Kavanaugh here. He's going to dig into this a little bit more. He says here, religion as a thing out there in the world, a basic trans-historical and transcultural component of human social life, identifiable by its content or function. If we could only reach agreement on what exact criteria separates religion from the secular. So that was actually, sorry about that. That was in the middle of a sentence. Let me reread that quote one more time so you can get the gist of it. Both of these, right, the substantivist and the functionalist, both of these tend to be essentialist approaches that regard religion as a thing out there in the world, a basic trans-historical and transcultural component of human social life, identifiable by its content or function. If we could only reach agreement on what exact criteria separates religion from the secular. So it's this thing that is almost like above history, right? It's trans-historical, but it's in the world and people adhere to it, right? And if only we can agree on the criteria for what make it religious versus the secular. So here he adds something really interesting. He says the reason that essentialist definitions have failed to meet with agreement is not a lack of scholarly ingenuity, but the fact that there is no essence of religion, such that we all know it when we see it, as Charles Kimball would have it. Religion is a constructed category, not a neutral descriptor of a reality that is simply out there in the world. So that's really interesting. So religion is a constructed category. The way we use the word in modernity, in our world, in our contemporary society, is, as we saw, not the way St. Thomas used the word, right? It's something that is actually constructed. It's not actually out there simply in the world as a particular substance or a functionary tool, you might say. So, in other words, what Kavanaugh is saying is quite simple. He says it right here. Religion is not simply found, but invented. The category religion, as it is most commonly used, is tied up with the history of Western modernity and is inseparable from the creation of what Talal Asad has called religion's Siamese twin, secularism. Isn't that fascinating? So, I just want to draw people's attention to a lot of the uh, I don't want to name any particular groups. I'm thinking of some very fringe groups, but let's say there's a lot of um, how to put this, contention over certain um, issues in our society that have to do with relativism. That at face value, completely agree with. In fact, Pope Benedict XVI thought that relativism was one of the number one problems in culture and society today, and I completely agree with him. Right, but we we then jump into the fray and engage in these debates without having defined our terms. You see, Benedict defines his terms because if you don't define your terms, it's just chaotic, and you can't get anything through any kind of reasonable conversation to begin. It just becomes tribalism, and it's just not fruitful. So going back to Kavanaugh, because there's a few more quotes here I want to read, and then we'll go back to Benedict. He says, the construction of the category of religion has become an important piece in the ideology of the West since the rise of modernity, both within Western cultures and in the colonization of non-Western cultures. So in other words, if you go over to Japan and you ask someone, what's your religion? They look at you like you're crazy. They don't have they have the category now, right? Because of Western influence. Or if you go to the Middle Ages, right, some kind of time machine, you ask St. Thomas, like, how many religions are there? He's not going to tell you, well, there's Islam, there's Judaism. No, he's going to be like, well, there's a lot. We got the Benedictines, we got the Dominicans, we got the, all these different ways of celebrating the liturgy, right? Because religion is a virtue that's expressed, specifically in the liturgy. So it's just a different category. And so what is this category that we use today? Why do we just take this for granted? I don't understand. We got to stop. Think. I'm taking things for granted. What is religion? There's a new way it's being used today, and its Siamese twin today is secularism. So we're presupposing the secular. That is very problematic for a Catholic. I'm not saying, he's guilty of anything. We're all kind of screwed here, right? But that's very problematic for the Catholic worldview, for reality, right? So, okay, let's go ahead and read another quote from Kavanaugh. He says here, the concept of religion is a development of the modern liberal state. The religious secular distinction accompanies the invention of private public, religion politics, and church state dichotomies. So, if we're going about online using the word religion in a way that's fundamentally liberal, we have to backtrack. We have to start thinking, how does the church use this word? How does the church understand the term religion? And I would say it's not simply, the church has just never, changed the way St. Thomas uses the term and kind of still uses it that way. Because clearly we look around us and the church is engaging with these other cultures, right? So I already kind of gave you a hint. But the point, though, is that the church, if she's going to speak in a way that people understand while maintaining her own worldview, then we have to understand how it is the church is speaking. And it can neither be something that is irrelevant to people today. Like you might say, if you say religion, people are not going to be thinking like St. Thomas. But neither can it be liberal. So we have to look at the language of the church. How is the church speaking of religion? And what does she mean? And we know because we have documents, right? And we also have theologians, great theologians. One of them was a pope, someone you might have heard of, Pope Benedict XVI. Okay, so just a couple more here. I keep saying that, but there's actually more than I thought. But these are really good. So bear with me. Here, Kavanaugh says there is no trans-historical or trans-cultural concept of religion. Religion has a history, and what counts as religion. So here he means the term religion has a history, and what counts as religion and what does not in any given context depends on different configurations of power and authority. The attempts to say that there is a transhistorical and transcultural concept of religion that is separable from secular phenomena is itself part of a particular configuration of power, that of the modern liberal nation state as it developed in the West. Religion is constructed as transhistorical, transcultural, essentially interior, and essentially distinct from public secular rationality. That's so key. Public secular rationality. This is where I want to turn back to Benedict. It's so important that we understand that what this creation of the category of religion in these modern liberal terms, what it does is it in fact nullifies all the ethical questions that have to do with man's spiritual nature. And it reduces rationality, right, to merely the empirical or to the scientific method, and only that is fair in the public square. It privatizes all questions about God, common good, etc., etc., etc. And we see here just using the term religion in that way without questioning what is religion is in fact to play on the enemy's ground, right? So we have to be more Socratic. We have to ask more basic questions and think more carefully, more philosophically, more responsibly, right? It's, it might be challenging at first, but it's not that hard. We're called to do this, right? Be renewed by the renewal of your mind, St. Paul says, right? So to be effective Christians, we have to offer an intelligent and persuasive and beautiful um, view of reality, right? And show how the liberal view is an imposed ideology on top of reality. We have to recover the real. And this is why I'm going to talk about David Schindler, his book, The Politics of the Real. But let's go back to Benedict because, well, before he was Benedict, but here's one thing he says that kind of summarizes really well what Kavanaugh was saying. He says, only in modern Europe has a concept of culture been developed that portrays it as a sphere separate from religion, or even in opposition to it. In all known historical cultures, religion is an essential element of culture, is indeed its determinative center. It is religion that determines the scale of values and thereby the inner cohesion and hierarchy of all these cultures. That's not at all the same thing as the liberal concept of the private, substantivist view of religion as that which is not secular. that which is not in the public sphere, which is merely empirical and scientifically based rationality reduced to the empirical. That's it, period. There's a hegemony going on here that is actually nullifying God and man's nature, I would argue, but and he does. Benedict argues this in the other book I'm going to cite by him. You see how this is no small thing, right? So the next part I want to read is this one right here. He says, it's on page 64 if you're interested, of Truth and Tolerance. We should talk no longer about inculturation, but about meeting of cultures, or if we have to use a technical term, about interculturality. For inculturation presupposes that, as it were, a culturally naked faith is transferred into a culture that is indifferent from the religious point of view, so that two agents that were hitherto alien to each other meet and now engage in a synthesis together. But this depiction is first of all artificial and unreal reality again, right? Because there is no such thing as a culture free faith. And because outside of modern technical civilization, there is no such thing as religion free culture. In other words, the conclusion here, to kind of simplify, but the conclusion, and this is a helpful way to look at it, I really think. The conclusion here is that what is religion? Religion is culture, right? Now, what necessarily follows from this is that Christianity cannot be called a religion. Now, colloquially, of course, we can call it a religion. I'm not, I call it a religion, right? I'm not trying to say, I mean, we do have to be careful with our terminology, but in the train of thought that we've been following since the beginning of this live stream, you see, if religion is culture, right, then Christianity, right, in a certain sense, is also a culture. So let me, I got lost in my own thinking here. So what I'm really trying to say, and I'll just give you the conclusion and work from there. What I'm really trying to say is that other religions are to Christianity what nature is to grace. Now, what that means is this: nature, right, is not just this neutral, wonderful thing that is self-contained and happy on its own, right? So, I think it was Chesterton, right, who said, if you deny the supernatural, you don't get the natural, you get the unnatural. And that's the thing. Nature on its own is fallen and therefore is depraved. There's evil in nature. But we're good Catholics, right? So it's not totally depraved. There's also good in nature. Now, what makes a culture a human culture is the common nature that its members share. And therefore all culture is an expression of human nature. And religion is culture. There's no such thing as religion as a thing that is substantively separate from culture. However, with Christianity, there is this idea that it is to other religions what grace is to nature. But grace, again, is not also completely separate, as if it's this substantive, reified thing either. It's the relationship of human nature with God, the freedom of man with the freedom of God, a union of freedoms in the person of Jesus Christ. That's why he is the last man. Right here, grace makes us more natural. Right? It makes us supernatural in the sense where we are divinized. God became man so that man would become God. Right? And so, Christianity does have its own culture. So that's why we can say, in this sense, we can say it is a religion, right? Because Christianity, that's why at one point, Benedict says, Europe is Christianity. Christianity is Europe, right? But that's why he doesn't want to talk about inculturation as if faith was not culture. It shows up somewhere and it imposes itself in a competitive way in that culture, right? Or it gets, compromised by kind of becoming that culture. No, he calls it interculturality, interculturation, where cultures, because they're not these sealed things in a vat, right, but are porous. And if they're rich, right, why are they porous and rich? Because they're human. And human nature, although it's depraved, is not totally depraved and seeks deep down God. It seeks grace, right? And yet it also likes to sabotage itself. We all know this from experience, right? And so that's the relationship of Christianity to other religions. So one way to put it maybe is that um, God wills all cultures just as much as he wills human nature itself. God wills every human culture. This does not mean that human nature is not depraved or that human cultures do not find themselves depraved at various levels, but that it is not totally depraved. And so Catholicism is to other cultures what grace is to nature. And so religion is the value system. Here's the definition, guys, kind of, right? For our purposes. Religion is the value system of a culture, right? In fact, it is the culture itself. But nature on its own is unable to save itself and is depraved. That's why it needs God's grace. It needs revelation. It needs Christianity. It needs Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ doesn't destroy cultures. He's their fulfillment. That's why Christ fulfills not just the Old Testament, but also the history of Greek philosophy and the Roman expansion of the time. And these three cultures of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome form a new synthesis. This is how David Schindler puts it in his book, The Politics of the Real. Let's see if I can maybe find the quote real quick. I don't know if I can. I probably can't. It's too late for that. um, so that's kind of what I wanted to say today is that a lot of times I think we got to realize, Pope John Paul II, although he wrote in his letter before the meeting that he wasn't engaging in any syncretism, it still looks bad, and Ratzinger at the time did have some reservations about the optics, right? And yet Ratzinger does kind of mature in that, and he has his own ACC gathering, but he puts some more, he's more careful, right? It reminds me a little bit of the relationship between Paul and Peter in Galatians and then Romans. There's a fascinating thing happening there where in Galatians, Paul says he rebukes Peter, right? And then in Romans, he actually says something. We don't have time to get into it here. Maybe there'll be a good video. It's actually a really fascinating part of scripture where in Romans, he says that basically Peter was right and that he was wrong in rebuking Peter. But Paul's principles stay the same. But why was I saying this? Well, because my point though is that we have to remember, right? Relativism is, I think, one of the most devastating things of today. One of the biggest threats of today, and that is something that we need to talk about at length. And I do, and I have in other videos, and I will again because it really does warrant more conversations. In fact, if you haven't, check out my video called The Eclipse of the Gentleman. And you'll see how everything I say about relativism there ties directly into this video right here. So I encourage you to watch that. I'll put a link in the show notes. My point, though, is that when we are upset about something confusing, I understand. It's understandable, right? You're not crazy. But you have to ask yourself fundamental Socratic questions, right? If you don't know where to turn, I would say turn towards someone who is a good Catholic, who's wise, knows their faith, and knows where to turn. Someone who trusts the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my point, ultimately, to get back to my point, which is if you don't understand something, you feel confused, it sounds like relativism, ask yourself the basic question: what is religion? And we have to remember the church uses terminology, and it must do so in a way that is not like liberal secular liberalism, right? Because liberalism, as Schindler puts it in this great book, The Politics of the Real, liberalism is ideologically construed as the direct antithesis to Catholicism, to the tradition, capital T, the historical tradition of the synthesis of Rome, Athens, and Greece. So we really need to be careful before we jump on the internet and freak out and accuse, in this case, Pope Francis of religious relativism because of the Abu Dhabi statement or stuff like that. We have to ask ourselves, maybe I'm operating with categories that are in fact liberal. And I have to realize that it actually is a good thing to familiarize myself with the language and meaning and content of the church's teaching, right? It has a consistency that sometimes seems foreign to us if we're so used to the secular world we live in. And so this calls for a genuine conversion. So I want to end with, of course, much more could be said about this, right? But we have to ask the question, what is religion? Well, religion is culture, right? Catholicism, in that sense, is not a religion, but it's what Catholicism is to other is religions is what grace is to nature, right? In a certain sense, I think this is what Andrew Willard Jones, or it might have been Schindler himself, I can't remember. They say that other religions are in potency, in a relationship of potency to Christianity, which is in a relationship of actuality to other religions, right? And and so there's an imperfection, and depravity as well. I think I'm being pretty clear here that there's depravity and falsity, right? That is incompatible. Um, but we have to remember that religion isn't this like substantivist thing, right? That's a liberal secular way of thinking. It's not a Catholic way of thinking. Okay, I've been rambling for far too long. Let me read this last quote from Schindler, and I'll look at the chat box real quick. So if you have any questions, actually, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll see if I can answer them as best I can. But Schindler basically says this. Oh, you know what? You guys are in luck. I actually want to read some more Benedict. So Schindler says this. It's on page 193 of The Politics of the Real. The intention is precisely not to single out Catholicism, which would again presume the liberal horizon we are calling into question, as one of the Christian denominations or one religion among others, right? But as the extension of the incarnation, which gathers up the defining strands of Western civilization. So that's just a nice tidbit. There's a lot more in this book, but in other words, there's a fundamental difference, right? You see, Catholicism, in the introduction here, Schindler calls it a real symbol. It's a form. It's a cultural form. It's not a intellectual philosophy or system or theological worldview that's abstract that I assent to because I think it's correct versus this or that. It's actually a historical form. It's an actuality, right? It's not a potentiality that I actualize by choosing it. You see, that's the liberal vision here. So that's what's different here. The relationship between other religions and Catholicism is really a relationship between potency and actuality. And the reversal of that is precisely what liberalism does. It potentializes God himself, creating a practical atheism. It nullifies God, basically. So, all the fancy language aside, I want to end with a quote from Pope Benedict. Okay. And this is along the same lines as Schindler, but basically, Ratzinger says this is a book that is, again, I strongly recommend. I mean, it's not as good as Truth and Tolerance. I should put it differently. Truth and Tolerance is amazing, in a way that is higher than this book, but this book is also amazing. But Truth and Tolerance is better. This is called A Turning Point for Europe? Question mark. By Joseph Ratzinger. But he says here on page 43, the ethical vision of the Christian faith is not, in fact, something specific to Christianity, but is the synthesis of the great ethical intuitions of mankind from a new center that holds them all together. You see, it's the actualizing of all the potencies, but in a way that the potencies themselves cannot actualize themselves. In other words, grace heals and elevates nature. Nature can't do it itself. It needs salvation. It's depraved and needs salvation. Ultimately, what I want to say is this. This very definition of the term religion nullifies this great ethical tradition and reduces the public conversation merely to the empirical and the scientific, merely to what is scientifically rational, merely empirically rational. Modern rationality is a reduced rationality that actually excludes any and all actually meaningful questions of human existence. The most human forms of knowledge are actually excluded. Those questions that have to do with our origin and our destiny and how we ought to act in light of those are excluded because of this definition of religion. They're excluded from the public sphere. So, what is the Catholic Church saying? She's saying that this is suicide. that we need all of the ethical insights of the great tradition of our past, and that these also have a voice in the public sphere. And that ultimately Christianity, right, is the criterion that promotes this idea that we ought not to privatize this form of knowledge. And that is exactly what the Second Vatican Council is saying and what the post-conciliar popes are saying. And you see why is this the case? Because what is in view here in our increasingly globalized world is something that works because it's based on the truth that is love. It's based on the humanity of God. And that is the logos of all further ethos in a culture that will promote human dignity, peace, and truth and not relativism. Because if you in the liberal in defining religion this way, in the liberal conception, you see relativism is enshrined as long as it's private, which means that in a certain sense it becomes a dictatorship. You see, this is what Pope Benedict meant by the dictatorship of relativism. What he's proposing here is the authority of the truth, which ensures genuine freedom, unlike the liberal false promises, which have not delivered, as we all know. And that's the point. You see, there's a logic here. There's a profound logic here in the text of the council and the teaching of the magisterium. And so maybe we ought to rethink a lot of these disputes online. Calm down and trust in God and not think that, and really kind of be more humble, right? Pope Benedict once said, we need to be humble enough to allow the truth to find us. And another thing he said, which I really like, is that we must not claim to possess the truth. Sorry, that sounded wrong. He said we do not possess the truth. The truth possesses us. You see that first part of that sentence sounds kind of liberal, right? Where's Dom going with this, right? But hear him out, right? We do not possess the truth. The truth possesses us. That's a much deeper perspective that transcends these oppositions, these false dichotomies that people are stuck in, completely stuck in. And that's really been my story. Is I've read these great thinkers and they unstuck me, and it can be frustrating when you look at the landscape. It seems like the culture is stuck, and I wish it would allow itself to be unstuck, right? And so that's what I try to do. Obviously, I'm infected by secular liberalism just as anyone else out there. Heck, I have a YouTube channel, I got a phone. So let me look at the chat. Oh man, more than usual. Yeah, David. We sort of say there's the big five of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and all the rest that are like them, as if that's enough. Yeah, I mean that's kind of right. We think of them as these substantive, right? Substantivist, excuse me, things that are religions. But if you press more closely, it becomes really elusive as to the definition of religion. Because what is it? Why is Marxism not a religion? So then you have the substantivist and then the functionalist, and then you realize, but like the only thing that makes the definition of religion even a word to be used is its counterpart, its Siamese twin, secularism. And so it implies the privatization, the nullification of all forms of rationality that are not empirical. That is suicide culturally. That's suicide. Yep, Tarzan, gotta love Pope Benedict 16th. Absolutely. James, I went back to school this spring for a BA in religious studies, so this is interesting to me. That's wonderful. Yeah, I strongly recommend you read Truth and Tolerance by Pope Benedict XVI. That would be by Joseph Ratzinger at the time. That would be the first one I recommend. Then maybe Schindler's book on the politics of the real will be next. It's, I think, a little bit more difficult than Benedict's book. But Truth and Tolerance would be the first one I'd recommend. And you're absolutely right, Sean, right? The dictatorship of moral relativism. It's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, We all know this. I mean, it's obvious to anyone who is trying to be Christian today, right? So that's what I had about the Catholic Church and world religions. We got to just stop and ask the question. Well, wait a minute. What the heck is a religion? And might there not just be some ideological presuppositions that are unbecoming of us to adhere to? And so being more reflective, more self aware of the language we use and the way we think is part of, I think, what Paul meant by being renewed by the renewal of your minds. What I think Paul fully meant is being renewed by the Logos, right? Which is by the person of Jesus Christ, by the logic of love in a certain sense, by the sacrificial the Paschal mystery, by the sacrificial dimension of God's emptying of Himself, right? So this is something that's both. It both changes the way we think and it changes what we do. The term I'd use is that it's existential. We have to really be renewed in our existence. We have to be logified, and so we have to apply that both to what we do, how we love people, and also to what we think and how we use words, all that stuff, right? And I'm a leper preaching to lepers. I'm trying my best here with all of you guys. Um, yeah, so I'm trying to minimize some of my internet use. Obviously, I think that's kind of a given. We should all be trying to do that, especially today. So I just would encourage everyone else to, at least try to do that here and there as well. So that is all I had today to talk about. Don't let the secular, liberal, technocratic hegemony of the liberal state turn you into pagans who adhere to Christianity as if it was slapped on top of a purely natural and secular world. So, with that being said, thank you all for watching. If you enjoy this kind of off the cuff lecture, thought of the day type thing, like the video, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to see when the next one comes out, hit the notification bell. Of course, if you want me to continue my studies and to keep making stuff like this for you all, consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project or going to my YouTube page and sending me something through PayPal. I'll be very grateful. I'll pray for you and I will put it into my studies or into gear maybe for the channel. Regardless, I will use it for the content, if that makes sense. Finally, you can find all podcast episodes and articles and contact info, everything basically at www.theecclesiablog.com. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you guys next time. God bless.